I stood in my garage staring at the certified letter from the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association, feeling my blood pressure rising with every word I read. They were fining me $250 for improper storage of hazardous materials, because I had 3 sealed jugs of antifreeze sitting on a metal shelf in my detached garage. The letter was signed by Patricia Dawson, the HOA president who had made my life a living nightmare since I moved to this subdivision in Phoenix, Arizona, 6 months ago. My name is Kevin Jameson, and I'm a 34-year-old diesel mechanic who spent the last decade working on heavy equipment before opening my own mobile repair business. I know more about proper chemical storage than most people could ever imagine, and the setup in my garage wasn't just compliant with federal regulations. It exceeded them by a significant margin. I walked back into my house and tossed the letter onto my kitchen counter, pulling out my phone to call my lawyer friend Marcus. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Kevin, what's up?" "The HOA is fining me again. This time they're claiming I'm improperly storing hazardous materials." Marcus groaned. "What did you do now?" "I have antifreeze in my garage, in factory-sealed containers, on a metal containment shelf with a secondary catch basin that can hold twice the volume of all 3 containers combined. It's better than what most professional shops use. Send me the letter." "I'll look it over," Marcus said. "But Kevin, this is the 4th complaint they've filed against you in 6 months. Are you sure you're not antagonizing Patricia?" "I'm literally just existing in my own house," I said, feeling frustrated. "Last month she complained about my work van being parked in my driveway. The month before that, it was about my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall, even though I just mowed 2 days earlier. Now this. Well, document everything. Take photos of your storage setup. Get the manufacturer specifications. If this goes to court, you'll want evidence." I hung up and immediately grabbed my phone to photograph my garage setup. The metal shelf was industrial grade, purchased specifically for chemical storage. The secondary containment system was a custom-built steel basin that sat beneath the shelf, welded seamlessly to prevent any leaks. I'd spent over $800 on this setup because I took safety seriously, both for myself and my neighbors. The next morning, I received another letter. This one wasn't certified, just stuffed into my mailbox. Patricia had filed a formal complaint with the county, claiming I was operating an illegal chemical storage facility in a residential neighborhood. She'd also sent copies to the fire department and the Environmental Protection Agency. I couldn't believe the escalation. 3 jugs of antifreeze, something every car owner in America has in their garage at some point, and she was treating it like I was running a meth lab. I decided to be proactive. I called the fire department myself and asked them to come inspect my garage. If they signed off on my storage setup, Patricia would have no leg to stand on. Fire Marshal Rodriguez arrived that afternoon in his white SUV. He was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and a no-nonsense attitude. I showed him into my garage and explained the situation. "So the HOA president is claiming this is hazardous?" he asked, examining my setup with a critical eye. "That's what her letter says." He pulled out a flashlight and inspected the welds on my secondary containment system. He checked the ventilation in my garage. He examined the labeling on each container. Then he pulled out a tablet and started taking notes. "Mr. Jameson, this is probably the best residential chemical storage setup I've seen in my career," he said. "Your secondary containment exceeds federal requirements. The ventilation is excellent. Everything is properly labeled and secured. I don't see any violations here. Can you put that in writing?" "Absolutely." I'll file a report with the county and send you a copy. But I have to ask, why would your HOA president claim this was dangerous? She doesn't like me, I said simply. This is the fourth complaint in 6 months, and they've all been without merit. Rodriguez shook his head. Document everything. People like that don't stop until someone makes them stop. He left 20 minutes later and I felt vindicated, but that feeling didn't last long. The following day, Patricia showed up at my door. She was in her late 40s, with blonde hair cut in that distinctive speak to the manager style, wearing yoga pants and a designer top that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her face was already twisted into that expression of righteous indignation that I'd come to recognize. Mr. Jameson, we need to talk about your flagrant disregard for community safety. The fire marshal inspected my garage yesterday, I said calmly. He found no violations. In fact, he said my storage setup exceeds federal requirements. Her eyes narrowed. That's impossible. I saw those chemicals sitting in your garage. That's clearly a hazard. They're in factory-sealed containers on an industrial-grade storage system with secondary containment. It's safer than 99% of residential garages in America. The HOA board will be reviewing this matter at our meeting next week, she said icily. And I'm increasing your fine to $500 for insubordination. Insubordination. I'm not your employee, Patricia. I'm a homeowner who's following all applicable laws and regulations. You signed the HOA covenant when you purchased this property. That makes you subject to our rules, and I determine what those rules mean. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my temper in check. I'll see you at the board meeting. She turned and walked away, her steps clicking sharply on my concrete driveway. I watched her climb into her white Mercedes SUV and drive off, already planning my strategy for the board meeting. Over the next week, I compiled an extensive file of documentation. I had the fire marshal's report, manufacturer specifications for my storage system, federal guidelines for hazardous material storage, and photographs showing every angle of my setup. I also researched the HOA's own bylaws and discovered that they had no specific regulations about chemical storage. Patricia was making up rules as she went along. Marcus agreed to come with me to the board meeting as legal counsel. Don't lose your temper, he advised. Stay calm, present your facts, and let them make fools of themselves. The board meeting was held in the community center, a modern building at the entrance to our subdivision. When Marcus and I arrived, the parking lot was already full. Apparently, word had spread about the dispute, and people wanted to see how it played out. Inside, the meeting room was set up with a long table at the front where the 5 board members sat. Patricia was in the center, flanked by 2 women and 2 men who I recognized from around the neighborhood, but had never formally met. Rows of folding chairs faced the table, and at least 50 residents had shown up. Patricia called the meeting to order with her gavel, going through various routine business first. Budget discussions, landscaping contracts, plans for the community pool. I sat there for 45 minutes, waiting for my item to come up on the agenda. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat dramatically. Now we come to a serious safety concern. Mr. Kevin Jameson has been storing dangerous chemicals in his garage in violation of our community standards. The board has reviewed this matter and agrees that immediate action is required. I stood up, and Marcus stood with me. May I address the board? Patricia looked annoyed. You may have 3 minutes. First, I'd like to submit the fire marshal's report into the record. Marcus walked forward and handed copies to each board member. As you'll see, Fire Marshal Rodriguez inspected my garage 6 days ago and found that my chemical storage setup not only meets, but exceeds all federal safety requirements. One of the male board members, a thin man in his 60s named Gerald, was actually reading the report. His eyebrows went up. "This says your secondary containment system is rated for twice the volume of the stored materials." "That's correct. I built it that way specifically to ensure maximum safety." Patricia cut in. "The fire marshal is only one opinion. Our community has standards that go beyond federal requirements." "With respect, Mrs. Dawson, the HOA bylaws contain no specific regulations about chemical storage." "I've reviewed them thoroughly. What you're citing are standards that don't exist in any official HOA document. Are you calling me a liar?" Her voice went up an octave. "I'm saying that you're enforcing rules that were never properly enacted by the board or voted on by the membership. That makes your fines invalid." Marcus stepped forward. "I'm Marcus Chen, Mr. Jameson's legal counsel. The HOA's authority is derived from the covenants, conditions, and restrictions filed with the county. Those CCRs must be followed precisely. Any fines or penalties imposed outside those parameters are legally unenforceable and could expose the board to liability for harassment." The other board members were now looking uncomfortable. One of the women, a redhead named Susan, spoke up. "Patricia, did we actually vote on chemical storage rules?" "We have general safety provisions," Patricia said defensively. "General provisions that have to be interpreted reasonably," Marcus interjected. "The fire marshal, an actual expert in hazardous materials and safety, has determined that Mr. Jameson's setup is exemplary. No reasonable interpretation of a general safety clause would prohibit what he's doing." Gerald was nodding. "I have to agree. If the fire marshal says it's safe, I don't see how we can claim otherwise. We're not experts." Patricia's face was turning red. "This board has a duty to protect property values and resident safety. Mr. Jameson's flagrant disregard for community standards sets a dangerous precedent." "What I'm doing is storing 3 gallons of antifreeze in a manner that exceeds professional shop standards," I said firmly. "I'm a diesel mechanic. This is what I do for a living. I know these regulations inside and out." Another board member, a man named Thomas, cleared his throat. "I move that we dismiss the fine and consider this matter closed." "Second," Gerald said immediately. Patricia looked furious. "We haven't discussed this properly. I'm the president and I'm telling you this is a safety issue." "Let's vote," Susan said. "All in favor of dismissing the fine?" Gerald, Thomas, Susan, and the other woman named Michelle all raised their hands. Only Patricia abstained. "The motion carries," Susan said. "Mr. Jameson, your fine is dismissed." I nodded. "Thank you. I'd also like to formally request that the board consider adopting clear, written standards for chemical storage so that future disputes can be avoided." "That's an excellent suggestion," Gerald said. "I'll work on drafting something based on federal guidelines." Patricia slammed her gavel. "This meeting is adjourned." She gathered her papers and stormed out of the room, her heels clicking angrily on the tile floor. Several residents came up to me afterward to shake my hand. One older gentleman said, "About time someone stood up to her. She's been on a power trip since she got elected." Marcus and I walked out to the parking lot together. "That went better than expected," he said. "She's not going to let this go," I replied. "You saw how angry she was." "Probably not. But you've got the law on your side, and now you've got board members who are questioning her judgment. Just keep documenting everything." I drove home feeling relieved but uneasy. Patricia Dawson struck me as the type of person who would escalate rather than back down, and I was proven right within 48 hours. I was under a client's truck on a Thursday afternoon, changing the oil on a fleet vehicle when my phone rang. It was my neighbor, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen who lived 2 houses down. "Kevin, there are people in hazmat suits at your house," she said, sounding alarmed. "What?" "Men in those white protective suits. And trucks. It looks like something from a movie." I scrambled out from under the truck, wiped my hands on a rag, and jumped in my van. The client's shop was only 15 minutes from my house, and I made it in 10, probably breaking several traffic laws along the way. When I turned onto my street, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. 2 fire trucks, an ambulance, a hazmat response vehicle, and several other emergency vehicles were parked in front of my house. Yellow caution tape had been stretched across my driveway. People in full hazmat gear were walking in and out of my garage. I parked on the street and ran toward my house, but a police officer stopped me. "Sir, you can't go in there. That's my house. What's going on?" "There's been a report of hazardous materials. The hazmat team is assessing the situation." "Who reported it?" Before he could answer, Fire Marshal Rodriguez emerged from my garage, pulling off his helmet. When he saw me, his expression darkened. "Mr. Jameson, did you call in a hazmat emergency?" "No, I just got here. What's happening?" "Someone called 911 claiming there was a chemical leak at this address. A serious one, potentially life-threatening. We had to respond with full protocols. There's no leak. Everything is sealed exactly as it was when you inspected it last week." "I know. We've already determined this was a false report, but we had to treat it as real until we could verify otherwise." I felt my hands clenching into fists. "Patricia Dawson." Rodriguez looked at me sharply. "Do you have evidence she made the call?" "She's the HOA president. She's been harassing me about this exact issue. We had a board meeting 2 days ago where the board voted to dismiss her complaints, and she was livid." A woman in hazmat gear approached us. She pulled off her hood, revealing dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. "Marshal, we've completed our assessment. Not only is there no leak, but this is one of the best residential storage setups I've ever seen. The secondary containment alone is impressive." "This is Dr. Sarah Winters," Rodriguez explained. "She's with the county hazmat team, Dr. Winters. This is Kevin Jameson, the homeowner." "Mr. Jameson, whoever called this in either massively overreacted or deliberately filed a false report. There's no emergency here. In fact, I'd like to use photographs of your setup for training purposes if you'd permit it. This is exactly how chemical storage should be done." "Someone deliberately called in a false emergency?" I asked, my anger building. "That's what it looks like," Dr. Winters said. "False emergency reports are a serious matter. They tie up resources that could be needed for actual emergencies." The police officer who'd stopped me earlier was now on his radio. He walked over to our group. "I've got a detective coming out. If this was a false report, we need to investigate." Over the next hour, I watched as the hazmat team packed up their equipment and the emergency vehicles gradually dispersed. Neighbors lined the street, watching the spectacle. I felt humiliated even though I'd done nothing wrong. Detective Williams arrived in an unmarked sedan. He was a tall black man in his early 40s, wearing a suit despite the Phoenix heat. He took statements from Rodriguez, Dr. Winters, and me, carefully documenting everything. "The 911 call came from a blocked number," he explained, "but we can trace it. If this was deliberately false, we're looking at charges of filing a false police report, which is a Class 1 misdemeanor in Arizona. It could also potentially be charged as reckless endangerment, given that emergency resources were diverted from actual emergencies." "I believe it was Patricia Dawson, the HOA president," I said. "She's been harassing me for months about this exact issue." "That's a serious accusation," Detective Williams said, But I'll be honest with you, cases like this are hard to prove unless we have direct evidence. Even if we trace the call to her phone, she could claim someone else made it. I have documentation of everything, I said. The previous complaints, the board meeting where they dismissed her case, all of it. Send that to me. It establishes a pattern of behavior. He handed me his card. In the meantime, I'd suggest installing security cameras if you don't have them already. After everyone left, I stood in my garage looking at my antifreeze storage setup. 3 sealed jugs of antifreeze. That's all this was about. 3 sealed jugs that had caused a full hazmat response and probably cost the county thousands of dollars in emergency response costs. I called Marcus and filled him in on what happened. "Kevin, this crossed a line," he said. "If she really did file a false emergency report, she could face criminal charges. Detective Williams said it's hard to prove. Maybe. But between this and the harassment, you might have grounds for a civil suit. Harassment, defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress. The false emergency report, if we can tie it to her, could be negligence or even malicious conduct. I just want her to leave me alone. Then we need to make it costly for her not to," Marcus said. "Let me start drafting a complaint. Even if we don't file it immediately, having it ready might encourage her to back off." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the humiliation of watching hazmat teams swarm my house while my neighbors gawked. The next morning, I went to a security store and spent $1,200 on a comprehensive camera system. I installed cameras covering my driveway, garage, front door, and backyard. Everything was high definition with night vision and cloud backup. 2 days later, Detective Williams called me. "Mr. Jameson, we traced the 911 call. It came from Patricia Dawson's cell phone." I felt a surge of vindication. So she did it. It appears so. But here's where it gets interesting. When we interviewed her, she claimed she didn't make the call. She said her phone was stolen that day and someone must have used it to make the false report. That's convenient. Very. Especially since she didn't report her phone as stolen until after we contacted her. And her phone records show it was in her possession before and after the call, based on cell tower data and other calls made from it. So what happens now? We're filing charges. Class 1 misdemeanor for false reporting, and we're also pursuing reckless endangerment charges. The county attorney thinks we have a strong case. I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Finally, there would be consequences for Patricia's behavior. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and I made sure to attend. Marcus came with me again, along with a formal letter demanding Patricia's resignation from the board. When we arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Patricia sat at the center of the board table, looking defiant despite the criminal charges she was facing. The other board members looked uncomfortable. Gerald called the meeting to order since, as vice president, he was apparently running things now. "Before we begin regular business, we need to address the situation with Mrs. Dawson." Patricia cut him off. "There's nothing to address. I've been falsely accused of filing a false report. This is clearly retaliation for my attempts to maintain community standards." "Patricia, the police have phone records placing the call from your device," Susan said quietly. "My phone was stolen. I've explained this." Marcus stood. "Mrs. Dawson, you didn't report your phone as stolen until after the police contacted you. Your own phone records show calls made before and after the alleged theft, and cell tower data confirms the phone was in your possession. You've also engaged in a documented pattern of harassment against my client, including multiple baseless complaints and fines." He placed a thick folder on the table. This contains documentation of every interaction between Mrs. Dawson and Mr. Jameson over the past 6 months. It shows a clear pattern of targeted harassment, combined with the false emergency report, which diverted critical public safety resources and could have endangered lives if a real emergency occurred elsewhere. This represents conduct that is not only criminal but grounds for removal from the board. Thomas spoke up. "I move that we suspend Patricia from the board pending resolution of the criminal charges." "Second," Michelle said immediately. "You can't do this," Patricia said, her voice rising. "I'm the president. I've dedicated years to this community." "All in favor?" Gerald asked. 4 hands went up. Only Patricia abstained. The motion carries. "Patricia, you're suspended from the board effective immediately. Please surrender any HOA materials, keys, and documents you have in your possession." Patricia stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. "This is illegal." "I'll sue all of you." "You're welcome to try," Marcus said calmly, "but I'd advise against it. You're already facing criminal charges. Adding a frivolous lawsuit would only make things worse." She grabbed her purse and stormed out, slamming the door behind her so hard that a framed photo fell off the wall. The meeting continued with regular business, but I barely paid attention. I was too busy thinking about the past 6 months and how dramatically things had escalated over something as simple as storing antifreeze in my garage. 3 weeks later, Patricia Dawson appeared in court for her arraignment. I attended along with Marcus. She had hired an expensive lawyer, a slick-looking man in a $3,000 suit who immediately tried to get the charges dismissed. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s named Judge Martinez, was not impressed. "Your client filed a false emergency report that resulted in a full hazmat response," she said. "Emergency resources were diverted for over 2 hours. The county incurred over $15,000 in costs, and you want me to dismiss this?" "Your Honor, there's no direct evidence that my client made the call," Patricia's lawyer argued, "except for the phone records, cell tower data, and the fact that she didn't report the phone as stolen until after police contacted her," the prosecutor countered. "We also have evidence of a pattern of harassment against the victim, establishing motive." Judge Martinez reviewed the case file. "I'm denying the motion to dismiss. Trial is set for 6 weeks from today. Bail is set at $5,000. Patricia's face went pale. She'd probably expected the charges to be dropped or reduced to something minimal. Instead, she was looking at a real trial with serious potential consequences. As we left the courthouse, Marcus turned to me. "She's going to fight this. Her lawyer is good and she has resources. But the evidence is strong. I think we'll win." "I just want this over with," I said. "It will be. Soon." Life slowly returned to normal over the next few weeks. Gerald turned out to be a reasonable HOA president, and the board operated much more efficiently without Patricia's constant drama. They even adopted my suggestion about clear chemical storage guidelines, using federal standards as a baseline. I focused on my business, which was growing steadily. Word had spread about the Hazmat incident, and ironically, it had become good publicity. Other mechanics and fleet managers were impressed by my storage setup, and I was getting more referrals than I could handle, but I couldn't completely relax. Patricia lived 4 houses down from me, and I saw her occasionally. She never spoke to me, just glared with undisguised hatred whenever our paths crossed. My security cameras caught her walking past my house multiple times, sometimes stopping to stare at my garage. I documented everything and sent updates to Detective Williams. He assured me they were building a strong case, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Patricia wasn't done yet. The trial finally began on a Monday morning in late October. The courthouse was downtown Phoenix, a modern building with tight security. Marcus and I arrived early and found seats in the gallery. Patricia arrived with her lawyer and a small group of supporters, mostly other HOA board members from nearby communities. She was dressed conservatively in a navy pantsuit, trying to look respectable and responsible. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Ortiz, laid out the case methodically. Phone records, cell tower data, the timeline of events. She called Fire Marshal Rodriguez and Dr. Winters to testify about the hazmat response and the lack of any actual emergency. In your professional opinion, was there any legitimate reason to call for a hazmat response at Mr. Jameson's residence? Ortiz asked Dr. Winters. Absolutely not. The storage setup was exemplary. There was no leak, no spill, no danger of any kind. This was a textbook example of proper chemical storage. And what were the costs and consequences of responding to this false report? Direct costs exceeded $15,000. But more importantly, every resource responding to this call was unavailable for actual emergencies. We had units diverted from across the county. If a real hazmat emergency had occurred during those 2 hours, people could have died. Patricia's lawyer tried to create doubt during cross-examination, suggesting that maybe someone truly believed there was an emergency and called out of genuine concern. But Ortiz had done her homework. She called neighbors who testified about the ongoing dispute between Patricia and me. She entered the HOA meeting minutes into evidence, showing the board vote that had gone against Patricia just days before the false report. She showed Patricia's pattern of complaints and escalation. Then, Ortiz called me to testify. I walked through everything, from the first complaint about my work van to the board meeting to coming home and finding hazmat teams at my house. How did you feel when you saw emergency responders at your home? Ortiz asked. Terrified, I said honestly. I thought something horrible had happened. Then when I found out it was about antifreeze storage I'd already had inspected and approved, I felt humiliated. All my neighbors were watching. They were treating my house like it was contaminated with plutonium. And you believe Mrs. Dawson made the false report? I know she did. She'd been escalating for months, and when the board voted against her, she snapped. She wanted to prove she was right about me being dangerous, even if she had to manufacture an emergency to do it. Patricia's lawyer cross-examined me aggressively, trying to paint me as someone with a grudge against his client. But I kept my cool and stuck to the facts. The trial lasted 3 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez asked. The jury foreman stood. We have, Your Honor. On the charge of filing a false police report, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of reckless endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. Patricia's face crumbled. Her lawyer immediately began arguing for a lenient sentence, claiming she was a pillar of the community who had made a mistake. Judge Martinez was unmoved. Mrs. Dawson, you deliberately filed a false emergency report as part of a harassment campaign against a neighbor. You wasted over $15,000 in public resources and potentially endangered lives by diverting emergency responders from legitimate emergencies. This was not a mistake. This was calculated, malicious conduct. She sentenced Patricia to 6 months in jail, 3 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered her to pay full restitution to the county for the emergency response costs. She also issued a restraining order prohibiting Patricia from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of my property. As the bailiff led Patricia away, she looked back at me with pure venom in her eyes. But I felt nothing but relief. It was finally over. Marcus and I walked out of the courthouse into the Arizona sunshine. "That went about as well as it could have," he said. "Yeah, I just hope she actually learned something from this. People like that rarely do, but at least she can't hurt you anymore." The HOA held a special meeting the following week to permanently remove Patricia from the board and elect a new president. Gerald won unanimously and immediately instituted new policies to prevent future abuse of power. "We're also going to establish a formal appeals process," he announced. "So if any board member issues a fine or citation, homeowners have a clear path to challenge it before it escalates." Several residents applauded. It seemed Patricia's reign of terror had affected more people than just me. Life settled into a comfortable routine after that. My business continued to grow, and I eventually hired 2 apprentice mechanics to help with the workload. The security cameras I'd installed caught nothing more interesting than the occasional package delivery or stray cat. Patricia served her 6 months and was released on probation. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she'd sold her house and moved to Scottsdale. I never saw her again. One Saturday afternoon, about a year after the trial, I was in my garage reorganizing my tools when Dr. Winters stopped by. She was in casual clothes, not the hazmat gear I'd last seen her wearing. "Mr. Jameson, I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I was in the neighborhood and wanted to follow up on something." "Of course, come in. And please call me Kevin." "Kevin, then. I wanted to let you know that we've actually adopted your storage setup as the recommended standard for our hazmat training program. We use photos of your garage to show first responders what proper chemical storage looks like." I felt a strange sense of pride. "Really?" "Absolutely. What you built is safer than most professional facilities. We've had several mechanics and small business owners reach out asking for specifications after seeing your setup in training materials. I just did what made sense from a safety perspective." "Exactly, which is more than most people do." She handed me a business card. "If you're ever interested, we occasionally need consultants for training programs. Someone with your practical knowledge and attention to detail would be valuable." After she left, I stood in my garage looking at those 3 jugs of antifreeze that had caused so much trouble. In a weird way, I was almost grateful for the experience. It had taught me to stand up for myself, to document everything, and to not back down when I was in the right. The Meadowbrook Estates, HOA, became one of the better-run associations in Phoenix under Gerald's leadership. They focused on actual community improvements rather than petty enforcement of arbitrary rules. Property values increased, and the neighborhood became known as a desirable place to live. I eventually expanded my business enough to open a small shop on the industrial side of Phoenix, though I kept my house in Meadowbrook Estates. It was home now, and I'd fought too hard to let anyone drive me away from it. Marcus and I remained close friends, and he occasionally sent clients my way who needed mechanical work on their vehicles. He also used my case as an example in his legal practice when dealing with HOA disputes. "You set a precedent," he told me once over beers. "Now, when HOAs in Phoenix want to go after someone, they have to think twice. They know that if they cross the line into harassment, there will be consequences." The restraining order against Patricia was still in effect, and I never had to worry about her showing up at my door again. I heard she'd gotten involved with another HOA in Scottsdale, but she'd apparently learned to be more careful about how she wielded authority. 2 years after the trial, the County Environmental Protection Agency reached out to me. They were developing new guidelines for residential chemical storage and wanted input from someone with practical experience. I spent several meetings with their team, helping them craft regulations that were both effective and reasonable. The problem with most regulations is they are written by people who have never actually done the work, I explained during one meeting. You need standards that are high enough to ensure safety but realistic enough that ordinary people can comply. The resulting guidelines were comprehensive but practical, and they included specific recommendations for secondary containment systems similar to what I'd built. The EPA cited my garage storage setup as an example of best practices. I framed a copy of their guidelines and hung it in my garage, right above the shelf that held my antifreeze. It served as a reminder of everything I'd been through, and how something as simple as proper chemical storage had changed my life in unexpected ways. My business continued to thrive, and I eventually bought the building where my shop was located. I hired 6 full-time mechanics and took on fleet contracts with several major companies in the Phoenix area. The reputation I'd gained for safety and attention to detail became my calling card. Clients would sometimes ask about the Hazmat incident, having heard the story through various channels. I'd tell them the truth, that I'd simply done things the right way and refused to back down when someone tried to punish me for it. The thing is, I'd explain, most people don't actually know the regulations. They just assume someone in authority must be right. But if you take the time to learn the actual rules and follow them properly, you can protect yourself from people who abuse their power. Gerald remained HOA president for several years before stepping down to spend more time with his grandchildren. The board elected a younger couple to take over leadership, and they continued the reform policies Gerald had implemented. The HOA became known as one of the most reasonable and well-run associations in the area. I even got involved with the HOA board myself eventually, serving a 2-year term as treasurer. It gave me insight into how these organizations operated and reinforced my belief that transparency and accountability were essential for any community association. During my time on the board, we implemented quarterly town halls where residents could voice concerns directly to board members. We also established clear guidelines for every aspect of community management, from landscaping standards to architectural modifications. The goal was to eliminate ambiguity and prevent future Patricias from interpreting rules however they wanted. The experience with Patricia taught the entire community valuable lessons about the importance of checks and balances, even in something as seemingly minor as an HOA. Power, no matter how small, could be abused if there weren't systems in place to prevent it. My garage, once the center of so much controversy, became something of a local landmark. Other mechanics and DIY enthusiasts would occasionally ask to see it, wanting to understand proper chemical storage. I was always happy to show them, explaining the principles behind secondary containment and proper ventilation. It's not complicated, I'd tell them. You just need to think about worst-case scenarios. What if a container leaks? What if something spills? Your storage system should be able to handle those situations without creating a hazard. The 3 jugs of antifreeze that had started everything remained on their shelf, properly stored in their secondary containment system. I never moved them, partly because they were still useful for my work, but also because they served as a reminder. A reminder that doing the right thing mattered, that standing up to bullies was important, and that sometimes the smallest things could lead to the biggest changes. Detective Williams and I crossed paths occasionally around Phoenix. He'd moved up to sergeant and was working in a different division, but he always remembered my case. You know, that false report case became a training example for our department, he told me once. We use it to teach officers about investigating harassment complaints and building cases against people who abuse emergency services. Even Fire Marshal Rodriguez stayed in touch. When he retired from the fire department, he became a consultant for businesses needing help with safety compliance. He'd sometimes refer clients to me when they needed mechanical work, and we'd grab lunch occasionally to catch up. "That whole situation was ridiculous," he said during one of our lunches. "I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've never seen someone escalate so dramatically over something so minor." But it exposed a lot of problems with how HOAs operate when there's no accountability. The legal bills from the entire ordeal had been substantial, but I'd recovered most of the costs through a civil settlement. Patricia's insurance company had paid out rather than risk a jury trial on the harassment and intentional infliction of emotional distress claims. The money helped me expand my business and pay for the security system that I'd never needed to use for anything serious after that one incident. Looking back, I realized how easily things could have gone differently. If I hadn't known the regulations, if I hadn't documented everything, if I hadn't been willing to fight back, Patricia would have driven me out of my home. She would have continued to bully other residents, and the HOA would have remained a toxic environment. But because I'd stood my ground and insisted on following the actual rules rather than Patricia's arbitrary interpretations, everything had changed for the better. The community was healthier, the HOA was more accountable, and other residents felt empowered to speak up when they disagreed with board decisions. My story spread beyond just Meadowbrook Estates. Local news had covered the trial, and I'd been interviewed by a reporter doing a series on HOA abuses. The article sparked conversations across Arizona about the need for better oversight of homeowners associations and clearer guidelines about what boards could and couldn't do. Some state legislators even introduced bills to reform HOA governance, though the measures faced opposition from associations that didn't want increased regulation. The debate continued, but at least people were talking about the issues and recognizing that unchecked HOA power could be a problem. As for me, I continued living in my house in Meadowbrook Estates, running my business and occasionally consulting on safety regulations. The garage where everything had started was just a garage again, a place to store tools and equipment and work on projects. But every time I looked at those 3 jugs of antifreeze on their shelf with the custom secondary containment system, I smiled. They represented more than just proper chemical storage. They represented the importance of doing things right, standing up for yourself, and not letting anyone bully you into accepting something you know is wrong. Patricia Dawson had tried to use her position as HOA president to harass someone she didn't like, and it had cost her everything. Her position, her reputation, her freedom for 6 months, and ultimately her home in the community she'd claimed to care so much about. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting power go to your head and the importance of treating people fairly, even when you disagree with them. The happy ending wasn't just that I'd won or that Patricia had faced consequences. It was that an entire community had learned from the experience and become better for it. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was now a model for how these organizations should operate, with transparency, accountability, and respect for residents' rights. And all because I'd insisted on storing 3 jugs of antifreeze properly, following federal guidelines and refusing to back down when someone tried to tell me I was wrong. Sometimes the smallest stands lead to the biggest victories, and sometimes doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, makes all the difference. The security cameras I'd installed were still there, faithfully recording nothing more interesting than Amazon deliveries and the occasional neighborhood cat. The restraining order meant I never had to worry about Patricia showing up again. My business was thriving, my home was peaceful, and the community had become the kind of place where people actually wanted to live. Years from now, when I finally decided to sell my house and move on to whatever came next, I'd probably take those 3 jugs of antifreeze with me. Not because I needed them, but because of what they represented. They were a reminder that standing up for what's right matters, that knowledge is power, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought over the smallest things. The story of the HOA president who tried to fine me for proper chemical storage and ended up facing criminal charges became neighborhood legend, passed down to new residents as a cautionary tale and a source of pride. It showed that even in the face of unreasonable authority, citizens could fight back and win if they were right and willing to stand their ground. And every time I walked into my garage and saw that perfectly designed secondary containment system holding those 3 jugs of antifreeze, I was reminded that doing things the right way, following proper procedures, and refusing to be bullied weren't just good practices. They were principles worth fighting for, no matter what it cost or how long it took. The end result was a better community, stronger protections for homeowners, and a personal victory that went far beyond just winning a case. It was about proving that ordinary people could stand up to petty tyrants and win, that following the rules mattered, and that sometimes the right thing to do was to fight back instead of backing down. My life had returned to normal, but it was a better normal than before. I'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for myself, the importance of documentation, and the power of knowing the actual regulations rather than just accepting someone else's interpretation of them. Those lessons served me well in business and in life, making me more confident and better prepared to handle future challenges. The 3 jugs of antifreeze sat on their shelf, properly contained and safely stored, exactly as they should be. They'd caused a temporary storm, but in the end, they'd been the catalyst for positive change. And that, more than anything else, made the whole ordeal worthwhile.